choices shape the market, our society, and our quality of life. That's why Euroconsumers helps millions of people in their daily choices, providing simple solutions to complex problems. Euroconsumers is a cluster of organizations, a network of people, a group established to protect consumer rights and well-being that brings consumers and companies together in transparent relationships of trust that respect their independence. Our deep understanding of products and consumption gives consumers a credible, expert voice worldwide. We bridge the gap between buyers and manufacturers, between supply and demand. And in this digital age, we create opportunities for all parties to come together in constructive dialogue, partnering to build a future of better products and services. Euroconsumers has the power of a global group that believes humanity can develop, grow, and change for the better, and that we can promote this by uniting millions of consumers in strength and speaking responsibly for them while simultaneously engaging in relationships of trust with responsible, sustainable companies.
Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to everyone watching Start Talking, or if you're watching the recording or listening back to the recording, welcome too. I'm Liz Cole, I'll be your host for today, where we're going to start talking about My Gaming Device Is Mine, Is Big Gaming Letting Us Play? So there's no doubt that gaming is popular. Apparently over half of all Europeans regularly play video games in a market that's worth 24.5 billion euros. But the sector has been hitting some hard times recently, not least because we all have a lot less time on our hands since the pandemic. But publishers, developers are all facing a range of problems, which we'll be talking about throughout today. And plus, there's a cost of living crisis, which is really starting to bite consumers. So in the midst of this difficult transition, some of the big gaming players are facing increasing scrutiny for what some see as moves to secure more market and more revenue. For example, console giants like Sony and Microsoft are cutting off access to third-party accessories, and online shopfronts for games are taking a slice of commission which many see as unfair and excessive. Then again, others argue that the gaming houses are delivering a diverse, creative sector and a proof that big can actually deliver on quality, innovation and value in the digital world. But what's not in doubt is that gaming is a huge part of the digital establishment, and many are now asking how competitive and fair the industry is and whether it can work better for gamers. So today we've brought together some experts in the games to discuss whether the big platform players are taking advantage of their position to restrict competition, whether it's fair that consumers are facing restrictions on their device use, and whether regulations and regulators are up to the job of keeping gaming competitive and innovative into the future. And I'm really pleased to have an excellent panel with me today. We have, first of all, JP Cavella, who has been the Managing Director at the European Games Developer Federation for over 10 years. So the Federation is made up of 22 national game developer associations, and together they represent over 2,500 gaming studios and about 40,000 people employed between them. Next up, we have Rick Gibson from Games Investor Consulting. Rick's been a key part of the video games world since the late 90s, and as the founder of the British Games Institute, he's been instrumental in promoting and growing the industry in the UK. And he uses his experience and knowledge to advise companies and government policy on video games. Next, we have Natasha Pearman, who is a partner at law firm Milberg London. Natasha's interests are on the interplay between competition and consumer protection in the context of platforms, and she's currently working on collective proceedings, otherwise known as class actions, against Sony and Valve, who run the Steam platform, and both of those are for excessive pricing. So we'll be hearing more about those later. And our fourth panellist is Friso Bostun, who is Assistant Professor for Competition Law and Digital Regulation at Tilburg University. His research focuses on the regulation of online platforms and technology more broadly under antitrust law and sectoral regulation. So welcome everybody. We're really pleased that you're here today. And remember to everyone watching that you're part of Start Talking too. So if you want to put questions and comments to the panelists, you can do so in the chat and we'll get to as many as we can. Okay, so we're going to watch a very short video soon to kick off the discussion. And this is a bit about some findings from our Euroconsumers Spanish and Belgian members about a problem that some gamers encountered late last year with their Xbox accessories. So you're going to hear from Thomas Kies, who works at Testachat, which is Euroconsumers Belgian member.
So at the end of last year, Xbox gamers got a notification on their console that their console controller was an unauthorized controller and that they had a grace period of 2 weeks after which it would be disconnected. The Spanish consumer organization OCU did a quick test on it. There is an argument to be made that there are some intermediary devices, USB keys or other devices with which you can connect keyboard and mouse to your Xbox. This gives a competitive advantage, but these measures don't solve all and the most important cheating problems. The most popular devices for hooking those keyboard and mouse, they still work. With those you can actually connect a PS5 controller or an older Xbox controller, and those are blocked to have any competitive advantage. People who don't have that much money and have a bigger family and needs cheaper or more competitive controllers are blocked out. There's a risk that Microsoft exerts too much control on the secondary market of controllers.
So that hearing from Thomas there, and he's just one of the many staff at Euroconsumers organisations who looks into these problems as they arise for people in whatever industry or sector that they're in. So Rick Gibson, I'm going to come to you first, and I need to stress first of all that Rick's not a representative of industry, but he has vast experience across the whole sector. So I'm really interested in whether you think Microsoft actually has a point when they block these third-party accessories on the grounds of security. What do you think?
So from our neutral kind of independent perspective, I think there are two sides to this issue. There is a long history of peripherals being used for piracy, which have plagued console manufacturers, publishers and consumers from the 1990s through until the present day, when people would rip off games and then they would embed them into unauthorized peripherals that would then be able to bypass the DRM of the consoles and allow not only pirated content, but a whole load of unauthorized code to run on consoles. And that damages, I guess, the platforms, because the platform's effectively been hacked. And in the modern age, that can mean all kinds of potential security concerns, as well as loss of revenue for the platforms. There's damage to the content makers, so the companies lose money on their IP because it's been ripped off, and that damages their ability to produce and market new content. And then there's also consumers, because consumers can be, without much warning, be kicked off platforms after buying what they thought was perfectly fine software or hardware. And I think that it's reasonable to expect console manufacturers to start to enforce restrictions through licensing access to peripherals, and they've been doing that for generations. Sony and Microsoft's anti-piracy measures are very robust, but Nintendo has recently had to go to court to fight two cases that are very similar to this, where peripherals have been used to provide pirated content. The other side of the story is that we've noticed that Sony has launched some very expensive headsets and controllers. And unlike the rest of the games peripheral market, where there are literally hundreds of devices that are supported, that there are very few, if any, directly comparable alternatives from third-party suppliers, which suggests that there are either severe licensing costs and restrictions, or possibly insurmountable hurdles, such as on the technology side, perhaps around haptics, that make it very difficult for competition. So I guess depending on which research company you believe, this is a $5 to $8 billion global market for peripherals. And you could argue that console manufacturers' revenues, which have been under a lot of pressure after the pandemic, where the last 2 years revenues have been flat, it could be that they're trying to take more control of the supply chain. I would then pass the buck completely and say that whether Sony's practices are a reasonable response to that threat is really one for lawyers and not for me.
Thanks very much, Rick. And interesting to hear about the piracy issue, because Friso, if I can come to you, your work looks at digital markets and considers where there might be anti-competitive practice. What's your take on the restrictions of these uncertified accessories, which I think what was surprising to the gamers involved was that they'd bought these accessories and there was no indication that they had to be using certified ones until they just said compatible with and wording to that effect. So suddenly finding out that you had 2 weeks to get something that was certified was quite a shock to them. So do you think it's reasonable, or is this a move into locking down the secondary market? Friso, can you unmute yourself?
Gosh, thanks for that.
Sorry. Sorry.
No, yeah, great but difficult question, because interoperability can definitely be a competitive issue, especially in the presence of market power. And this has a long history. Just to take you back to one illustrative case, in the US in the 1950s, we had the AT&T or Bell Company monopoly over telephone lines, but also over the telephone devices themselves. And at one point, this firm Hushaphone started making basically something to strap onto a telephone to, well, hush your voice with some plastic device. And AT&T immediately said, no, this should be banned. We're even able to convince some regulators. But in a court case, it came out that, well, no, this is essentially an abuse of monopoly power to prevent third parties from interoperating with your devices. Today, we see many of those cases, often involving tech companies. The Microsoft cases of the 2000s were about this. Apple is in hot water now because it prevents app developers from accessing different parts of its iPhone. So what matters in most of these cases, and also in gaming especially, is what you mentioned earlier, this transparency. If interoperability is denied, the manufacturer, Sony in this case, should be clear about this from the very start so that consumers can make informed choices. If they're not informed upfront, well, once you buy a PlayStation or another Sony device and you're only finding out later, well, that implies a real risk of consumer exploitation. The other side is, of course, developers. Once you give them some type of interoperability with your console, you must be sure to not degrade that later or apply it selectively. So that's essentially the big picture, and I'm happy to dive into specific parts of that later.
I suppose as a follow-up to that, is it a challenge for competition law and regulators who, as far as I can see, kind of quite like defined lines between markets when there's this blurring of hardware and software? I mean, are our regulations ready for this?
Yeah, this is a tough question. As you say, I mean, gaming markets are dynamic, which is a great thing in itself, but it also means that things kind of flow into each other. We had separate categories like PC gaming, console gaming. Now, with a device like the Steam Deck, for example, what is what? That definitely presents a challenge for regulators because they like a sort of clear market. For example, this is the console market. We can look at PlayStation, find them perhaps dominant in that market, and then regulate them. If you don't have that clear of a market, it becomes much more difficult to apply competition law, or at least to find problem with practices surrounding interoperability. So that's a tricky thing the regulators are dealing with. But we do see a lot of interest from regulators in grappling with these questions. So I'm sure that's something that over time is fixed, but there might be an interim where regulators are a bit flummoxed, and maybe where some issues don't get resolved in quite the way they should be.
Absolutely. And I think they are much more getting to grips with digital and technology antitrust issues generally, and certainly have over the last 10, 15 years. Can I bring Natasha in here? I'm interested in your view as to what other options Xbox could have for addressing security, as opposed to this sort of, well, it's like quite a blanket approach. Sorry, Natasha, could you unmute your mic? I'm so sorry.
Sorry, I should have been alerted to that problem. Apologies. I was just going to say, I think it's a really interesting step that Microsoft have taken, and weirdly, I wonder if in some way they've actually been galvanized by recent intervention by the French Competition Authority, where they looked at similar issues with Sony, and Sony was found that in that case to have abused its dominant position in relation to controllers for very similar conduct that Microsoft's now engaging in, whereby it had employed technical countermeasures, which it said were for counterfeiting, that disrupted the functionality of third-party game controllers. And then it also was employing an opaque licensing model, which meant it was very difficult for competing controllers to manufacturers to know exactly what they needed to do to be part of the official licensing program and how it met that criteria. So, I mean, I'm assuming that there's going to be more transparency and a degree of openness around what competitors to the Xbox controllers need to do to be part of the official licensing program. In relation to what can be done to address kind of alternative models for security and things. I mean, it's not an easy question to answer. You'll probably do a whole seminar on that alone. There's always been a degree of tension between IP rights and competition law, though at their heart that they're both trying to drive innovation and create benefits for consumers. IP rights, obviously, and their enforcement, importantly, by their very nature, can create monopolies and certainly can become a significant tool in the armory of a dominant entity. I think one thing that I would question, and JP kind of touched on some of this earlier, is the extent to which the piracy concerns and the protection of IP are legitimate, and whether or not they're really just kind of a shield and a way for these companies to have further and greater control over the ecosystems that they already control. I mean, my experience is that where you have technology-rich sectors like pharma, tech sectors like devices, mobile phones, and that kind of thing, that they're heavily guarded, and that they frequently, the patents and the IP that are being used, it's questionable as to the actual the real merit and the validity of that IP. But what it does do is it just makes it incredibly difficult for competitors to know what they can do in order to enter in without breaching potential IP rights. I mean, they're all issues that we're going to be facing on the Sony claim that we've got running in the UK, just in terms of how whether or not the reality is that by offering software development kits and other IP, Sony is somehow handing over, the keys, and it doesn't have any control there over what's happening on its platforms. We say that there are quite simple measures that can be taken to continue to allow, that system software and security and integrity to be maintained. And we don't think it's like, they're not insurmountable issues, and they're definitely not issues where, this kind of wholesale control can be objectively justified and good for consumers ultimately.
Okay, thanks very much. And JP, can I just bring you back in on here? Any comments?
Yep. So one very quick comment on this, just from the little bit from the business perspective. As was mentioned before, transparency is the key here. Not only from the consumer perspective, but also from the business perspective, because this kind of any opaque licensing policies or untransparent and unclear P2P contract terms are a huge challenge for anyone willing to enter these markets. You need to have this kind of stable market access environment in order to bring this kind of competing device to the market. And this is, of course, not only limited to controllers and consoles. This is a much wider topic in the digital markets, where often this kind of non-negotiable P2P contract terms are opaque, are non-transparent, are unclear, and it's very hard to anyone willing to bring something new for the markets to take this kind of risks needed to actually invest on those devices and get the risk investment for those devices if you don't know if you are going to be successful in that and if you might be kicked out.
That's a great comment, and I think certainly a lot of the makers of the third-party accessories were taken by surprise as well by the move. But moving on from the device use question, we're going to look at other areas where we might see choice and competition under strain, and that's in software. So again, I'm going to return to Friso to give a brief overview of how the distribution works currently in gaming and where there might be competitive conflicts.
Yeah, so there's been this long-standing sort of division between content and distribution, right? So the games we play and the devices we play it on. Bill Gates once famously said that content is king, but I think time has sort of showed that I think distribution is more king. If we look at the main distribution channels, well, can distinguish some different platforms there. PC is supposed to be the more open platform. You can download most of the software you like, but still, when you want to bring a game to market, we still see a dominance of Valve's Steam store, with some competition now from Epic Games Store. Mobile is a completely different story because mobile phones are very closed systems, the iPhone especially, but Android devices just as well. So there, if you want a game, essentially you have to go through the App Store, and that's Apple's App Store on iOS devices, Google's Play Store on Android devices. So the choices are very limited, both for consumer and developer. There might be good reasons for that, but still. And finally, on consoles, well, here we have a sort of very segmented market with different pretty close systems. When you have an Xbox, of course, you get your games in the Xbox Store, PlayStation Store. Here, maybe there's a bit of more of a good reason for this, because these devices are sometimes sold below cost, and you want to make up for that in a distribution or a commission fee on those software sales. So you reserve that market to yourself. But in all of these different systems, there's definitely a risk that the distribution fees really add up, become certainly to some developers exorbitant. So that's where the conflict between content and distribution becomes really clear. And we see that in cases all around the world, often brought by game developers, often the larger ones, of course. One good example here is Epic versus Apple. So Epic Games taken on Apple for its app distribution monopoly on iOS devices, specifically to its App Store, with Epic's contention being that they should be able to freely distribute their apps to their own app store, for example, or at the very least without paying Apple the 30% fee that it charges on any games or in-app purchases via its app store. So I think these we'll see more and more of those conflicts. Microsoft, of course, especially after its acquisition of Activision Blizzard, also have a strong incentive now to to make sure that those fees stay within reasonable range. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. That was a great introduction. And we've got on to the 30%, which has become a huge point of contention for many years now in these markets. So, Natasha, from the front line of litigation, really, let's hear about one of these cases that you're bringing on behalf of consumers in one of the segments that Friso mentioned, and that's platform stores. Can you tell us a bit about the case you're bringing?
Yeah, it's a nice segue, 30%. So, we're bringing a collective action. Alex Neil is our class representative. And essentially, we're looking at bringing, we have bought and have now been certified an opt-out collective action in the Competition Appeal Tribunal. So this is a standalone claim. It's not based on any infringement decision. It's based on, our own economic evidence and understanding of what's happening in this market. And essentially, the claim concerns the operation of Sony's PlayStation ecosystem, and in particular, how Sony has control over the distribution of digital PlayStation games and then in-game content. We say that the way that it controls that sale is problematic, and that it doesn't allow for any kind of competition in terms of digital distribution to take place. And then as a result of that, Sony is able to charge an excessive commission, which is, the 30% commission, which it charges to developers. Developers then build that into their price and the price at which they charge consumers, and ultimately consumers are suffering an overcharge, which is the compensation that we're seeking for them.
Okay, thanks very much. And we'll ask you a bit about the Steam store case later as well. Rick, can I bring you in here? And we're saying again, you're not speaking for industry, but if you were to step back and take a look at how the Sony store operates, and perhaps how the mobile app stores operate, what does a brand like Sony deliver for that 30% to consumers and to developers?
Sure. Well, there's really four types of investment that Sony and Microsoft, to a lesser extent Nintendo, deliver. So I don't want to talk just about Sony, obviously, because that's a live case. But in general, their models are built around four key things. The first is that the model, as Friso referenced, they usually the business model is predicated on for a good chunk of the hardware cycle for each console is predicated on making a loss during the early part of that cycle, and then making an eventual return via software sales, licensing, and peripherals. These cycles are repeated every 4 to 7 years. They seem to be extending as time goes on, and each time the console manufacturer has then to build back its installed base from scratch. So loss-leading hardware needs significant investment in cutting-edge technology in order to attract those early adopters at the very start of the cycle, at a price that is below cost of production when the audience is relatively small. And they do that because there's really quite a lot of competition between the other hardware manufacturers who are also doing the same thing at similarly competitive prices, although Nintendo tends to operate much closer to being profitable earlier in the console cycle. Now, this contrasts very heavily with mobile, where Apple and to some extent Google are closer to, if not actually in profit on their hardware from day one, and therefore can then start to build their entire commercial model much more easily. So the business model suggests that they might not be bringing some kind of unreasonable market power here. but I will leave the legal experts to comment on that, as I'm sure Natasha will. So then there's content. Sony and Microsoft, very, very little from Nintendo. They invest heavily in content, both first party, i.e. their own studios, but they also invest in third party content, not just in the form of exclusives to the really big titles, but also they have been priming the independent games development market, which has yielded hundreds, if not thousands, of smaller scale independent games over the years. And what that has done is that has really widened the ecosystem for content away from just the really big publishers towards funding interesting and sometimes very disruptive content from small indie producers that might not exist. Those companies might not exist without that kind of investment. Apple and Google don't do that kind of investment at all on mobile. So again, very different. Then there's curation. Console manufacturers keep a very strict control on the quality of games released on their platforms. And unlike mobile, where it's pretty much an automated box ticking exercise to get a mobile game launched, to ensure that you're signing up to privacy legislation effective in each territory, and also conforming to technology policies. For console manufacturers, they have a much higher bar. They're investing far more per title for a dedicated gaming device, and that the content dictates the success of those consoles, and whole console generations have been fought, won, and lost based on the quality of the content that goes onto the platform. And then finally, there's marketing. And again, just to finish my point about curation, the curatorial process on mobile is very, very light touch and tends to be about whether you know one of the people who's responsible for editorial policy in one of those app stores, which is less so the case on console. And then so marketing, console manufacturers invest billions in marketing their platforms, and they do that both not just for the hardware, but also for the software. And they target that very specifically at gamers, but at the start of the cycle, and then as the console cycle elongates and the installed base starts to get more mass market, that includes to people who might not define themselves as gamers, but who eventually become gamers. That means that they will market games made by lots of different companies, both large and small, and that also you can say is a benefit to the ecosystem and therefore to the consumer, because they get sight of that. If you look at mobile and how Apple's hardware and Google's hardware marketing seems to be focused, it focuses on hardware and the people who play, and much less on the software, and particularly for games. So we would look independently at this at the console market and conclude that even though there are only three main manufacturers, they do compete fiercely on price, on content, and these added value features, which do deliver value to end consumers.
Thanks, Rick. And what I love about the way you've spoken about that is it just unlocks what goes into, from the development side to how you get diverse games, and how all that gets to the consumer. And I suppose regardless of anyone watching, whether you'd want to agree or challenge that, I think it's a really useful insight into how the sector system works, which certainly I wasn't aware of all that detail before I started looking at this issue. I'm going to come back to Natasha now, just on the loss leader hardware issue. Natasha.
I mean, it's always a point which is floated, and it's something which I think all the console manufacturers make reference to in terms of justifying things like 30%. And I think even in Epic has previously justified, 30% commission that is happy to pay, the console manufacturers on the basis that they're loss leading. For me, I mean, we'll see what happens in the evidence as we work through Sony and disclosure and things. I think it's somewhat of an urban myth. We've done our own kind of economic analysis, and it just doesn't bear out. Is the reality of it. They might, they're not making a profit on day one, but over time the consoles do make profit in and of themselves. So that's what our own independent economic analysis has shown. So I question whether or not that is a valid justification, but it's going to be an important aspect of the Sony claim.
Thanks, Natasha. And I suppose it's also the nature of the collective proceedings in this type of case of how anti-competitive practice might impact on consumers that we'll get to see a lot more of this information and unpack some of those, some of the assumptions behind it, which is something we haven't been able to do so much recently. I'm just going to stick with you and ask about the case you're running against Steam, which is the main app store for PC gaming. Because obviously this is not the console platform. This is something separate. And how competitive do you think the PC gaming apps what do you call them, storefront sector is? I'd imagine not very.
Yeah, well, that's our view. So we launched a claim with Vicky Shotbolt as our class representative. Vicky is a leading consumer advocate. She's done a lot of work, particularly in things like loot boxes and digital harm, particularly as that relates to children as well. And so essentially, Valve is Valve is the owner of Steam. It developed Half-Life, which was a really popular game back in the 90s. And then leveraged the success that it had in game development around Valve to become the leading PC distribution, games distribution mechanism. And it really is like little more than an app store. There's not really been much innovation on the Steam store for quite a while now. So we say that Valve is abusing its dominant position in the distribution of digital games and add-on content for PC through the operation of price parity obligations. So these work by preventing rival distribution channels from gaining a competitive advantage by those rivals being able to offer PC games or add-on content cheaper than it's being sold on the Steam platform, and it doesn't just relate to sales being made cheaper. It's also the content being made or the games being made available on rival platforms sooner than they're launched on Steam as well. And so all of this, we say, has an impact on pricing to consumers as price harmonization across the market, which means there's no real incentive for developers to try and sell their games cheaper on rival markets because they'll have to sell at the same price on Steam anyway, and all of that is giving consumers a worse deal. Consumers are paying more for digital games and add-on content. Throw into the mix, a 30% commission. Valve's commission does go down depending on how many sales the developer has. So it can be as low as 20%. But I think even 20%, when you're considering what an app store is doing with little innovation, we think that there is very significant harm to consumers and significant loss as well.
Okay, thank you. And I guess we'll see these cases. They're relatively recently certified, so it will be over the next few years. I mean, they take a long time.
Yeah.
We'll see that. I'm just going to come back to Rick if you wanted to come back on that point from Natasha.
Yeah, I'd like to, just because of a couple of things she said, and also Friso said something earlier about the dominance of Steam, and I think let's just get some data would be useful here. So first of all, Valve is an extremely secretive company, and you really can't find very accurate data about it. And when people try and produce data, then Valve might stick its head up and say that's rubbish, but that's about it. So it'd be really interesting to see what comes out in disclosure, if anything. But the working assumption of most analysts in games is that Steam does dominate between 70 and 80% of the premium PC download market, but that is only a relatively modest proportion of the total $43 billion PC games market, the majority of PC games are not sold through Steam. They are sold direct to consumer by massively multiplayer and free-to-games companies, amongst whom are Epic, Microsoft, Roblox. And I won't run through a long list, because I won't remember them all, of the Asian massively multiplayer games companies that do take a very significant proportion out of this. Steam doesn't come pre-installed, so it's a very different beast to platforms where the operating system is mandated. It does share, I would agree, many characteristics, in fact, of mobile, and it does take the same largely blanket 30% as Apple and Google did until recently. And yes, there is definitely some complexity. If you look at the criteria that I was citing for the investment by consoles, Valve doesn't do a huge amount. It's thinner. It's not completely insubstantial. Its business model is mostly software, so it doesn't invest substantially in third-party content. It does invest in some curation, but probably not a significant amount more than Apple. Its consumer marketing is pretty negligible. And it has, I completely agree, got a lot of companies' backs up in the industry with some sharp practices around pricing and EULAs. But what I would say is that its market dominance is really quite tightly circumscribed into a corner of the PC market, rather than is often portrayed as it's so dominant. And I think it's also a bit more responsive to some of the changes in pricing that have been going on, not least because of Epic and them introducing their own store, but also all of the tiering that Apple and Google have introduced. And I suspect it will struggle to keep to maintain that 30%.
Okay, thanks, Rick, for that perspective. So it's a complex market, isn't it? And there's lots of different ways to be getting your games, which is why I really want JP to come in here. I mean, Rick obviously mentioned the mobile store, the mobile app stores, and the games that get downloaded from them. But all this focus on the consoles and Steam, are we looking in the right place when we're talking about competition?
Yeah, I think what Rick just mentioned is really, really important. It's really, really crucial that we keep in mind the fact that in the end, Valve is a small player. And that's because like the PC game markets is just a bit less than a quarter of the all global game markets. Console game markets, where Sony and Microsoft are huge players, is only a little bit more than a quarter of the global markets. About half of all games markets are dominated by two companies, Apple and Google, through their global mobile platform duopoly. And it's a very good reason why the European Commission, while started to have a look on the global digital markets, set the thresholds for this kind of market dominance to fall under the DMA quite high. And it's clear that Apple and Google and also the Microsoft PC operating system are over that threshold. And something important to keep in mind from the PC game markets is that there are many challenges with Steam. I fully agree that game developers are complaining a lot, and much have to be done, especially on their contract terms and their transparency and predictability and so on. But at the same time, when Epic Game entered, as mentioned by Friso in the beginning, in the PC markets, we saw that the competition started, and competition had an impact. Game developers started to have better deals from all the distribution channels. And that means that competition works. And that's the reason why it's so crucial now to actually ensure that the competition starts to work also on the mobile game markets. Because so far, Apple and Google have not allowed third-party distribution on payment systems in a real practical manner. Of course, to some extent, Google has allowed them before, but Apple didn't allow it at all. So now that this was rightfully targeted by the European Commission, we hope that there will be more competition in the mobile game markets. But again, it's important to keep in mind that this DMA, Digital Markets Act, only applies in the EU. So it's just the beginning of the long battle that takes place over the globe to widen the scope of this kind of platform regulations in different market regions to ensure that third-party payment systems and marketplaces have access to mobile markets. However, this is not only about game revenue share. It's also crucial to keep in mind that data access is a huge topic as well. With iOS 14, Apple, for example, was able to block access to from the consumers to make these kind of decisions who they want to give their data to. And these rights should always be in the hands of the players. It shouldn't be something that Apple should decide on behalf of the players who they want to give their data to. And also to access to operating system features, another huge issue that is an equally important topic in the platform economy, as is the revenue share. So yeah, we need to have a holistic view on the global game markets, which are the big players there, and target them, as well as then understand it's a much wider topic than just revenue share.
Thank you so much, JP. And you've mentioned those three letters, the DMA. Friso, this is obviously in your line of work, your line of study is going to be huge for you. So would you want to talk a bit about the DMA and in terms of gaming and its impact?
Yeah, I'd be very happy to. I mean, these competitional battles have been fought for a decade or even two now, but the European Union, and that's an important qualification, this is only for the EU, but it has now taken a different track and said, well, look, maybe there's, in these digital markets, there are too many competition issues to solve with, a case here and there. Why don't we regulate this in a more wholesale way? And the big focus of this regulation, the Digital Markets Act, has been those app stores of Google and Apple. If you just, in a first step, they were designated as so-called gatekeepers because of this crucial monopolistic role they play as the go-to between developers and gamers. And now they have to abide by the varied obligations. And if you just go through the list, it's just 20 or so, but a lot of them apply to their app stores. I think the most important one, just to go through 2 or 3, are that, first of all, they'll have to allow different app stores within their ecosystems. So it won't be just Apple's App Store or Google's Play Store. Perhaps Epic or Microsoft comes up with their own app store. This could lead, for example, to better curation, more targeted at gamers. So there's definitely some opportunity there. It will certainly also impact the fees. There's an obligation relating to fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory rates, which are likely not quite the 30% that they currently are, but somewhere lower. And also just, on data access, things like linking out for payments to the own developers' websites. So I think the DMA, was not specifically adopted for gaming, but I'm assuming this will have a huge impact on the whole ecosystem and will likely lead to more freedom for players, for gamers. Of course, it also puts some burden on those gamers to make use of those new freedoms and not stick to what they know, such as, Apple's App Store. So that'll be a real test.
So I'm interested, just thinking then about what the consumer would see if if the changes from the DMA came through as they're envisaged. So when you say like there'd be some innovation in app stores, are you thinking like there might be a specialized children's app store or a specialized like games app store for indie games? Is that the kind of thing that we'd hope to see?
Yeah, that's where I see an opportunity. I mean, the App Store has all the apps, which means it's not very focused. It's hard to come to the surface for a specific type of game. So to bring in another app store, of course, you're fighting an uphill battle against Apple. But the way to do it is, I think, to differentiate yourself by focusing on specific user groups, specific segments of games. So it could be an indie app store. It could be an app store targeted at kids, as you mentioned. I think you'll have to do something different to be successful. And hopefully consumers, I assume consumers are looking for that difference. Developers will also likely be happy to see it. Of course, this will take time. We're seeing the first announcements of new app stores now, but consumer adoption will likely take some time.
Okay, that would be interesting, because I think sometimes these big competition discussions, it's sometimes hard to see, well, what's that actually going to look like, and it's going to be in a few years, and will there be a big difference? But interesting to think about what could be different. Rick, you wanted to come in on the DMA as well.
Yeah, so while Google has always allowed third-party app stores, it has arguably used its market power to ensure that they really don't bother it at all, whereas Apple has been more naked in saying you're banned. We won't allow any third-party app stores, and of course has been fighting a lawsuit with Epic on this. And its response to the DMA, it's hard not to see it as a pretty cynical response. They've not only kind of obfuscated deliberately the charging structure to make it quite arcane and difficult to navigate, but they've said that they had to follow the DMA's guidelines and allow third-party app stores, but by slapping a 27% tax on them, which is quite a revealing number because it tells you what Apple thinks is the actual cost of running an app store. They effectively make them commercially unviable and therefore dead in the water, and had before Europe responded, had big American companies like Epic throwing up their hands. I think moving on from DMA though, I think that there are several really egregious anti-competitive policies that Apple utilizes, and probably the one for me that is the most damaging to games companies is them cancelling advertising tracking with a policy called ATT, which effectively kills the ability of games companies to track users from an advert to becoming a player and then all the way through the life cycle of the player. And they did that in the name of consumer protection and privacy. But what they've done is they've severely hampered mobile games companies' growth. They've made advertising less targeted and effective and therefore compelling for users. And they force games companies to consider advertising with the only service that allows better attribution and tracking, which by a shock is actually Apple itself. So this is subject to lawsuits in the US and regulatory scrutiny in France. It will have, I suspect, given that that the Europeans have a very robust regulatory system, I suspect that it will either lead to a huge windfall in terms of given how much of a company's turnover can be fined if a company's been in breach. And it's also, interestingly, one that I think that Apple can do very little about, whereas in the States, of course, it can keep kicking on and on and on to a senior court.
Thanks, Rick. And I'm glad that you mentioned the tracking changes, because I think that was a good example of sort of unintended consequences, and again how selling it as a privacy thing has actually had such an impact on bringing newer games to market. Right, we don't have very long left, but I did really I want a quick question to Rick. I might stay with you actually just to talk about cloud gaming, because that's been something that has been in EU, US and the UK regulators' sights with the Microsoft merger with Activision, and they were a bit worried about the impact on the growing cloud gaming market. What do you think? Were they right to be worried? Do you think we'll see like a kind of Netflix of gaming anytime soon?
No. The cloud gaming market last year was estimated to be worth 395 million. And that's out of a total market of 213 billion. It's a really tiny corner of the market, and I think one of the problems that the CMA had is that its definition was very loose. They talked about streaming games. They also talked about subscription gaming. They mentioned Azure, which is both a tool set for a very commonly used tool set for games development, but also has some cloud infrastructure. They also made an assumption that every Game Pass user was actually streaming when comparatively few are. I don't think they fully understood the term, and I think that actually it was a gimme for Microsoft, who said, yeah, sure, we'll give you this market that we're not really that concerned about, and that's how they got through that regulatory process. We've seen it, I think, 5 times, this type of technology come and go. Major players, Microsoft, Sony, Google, Amazon, have all tried to do it. Substantial investment, hasn't ever reached a significant market, maybe in 15, 20 years, but it's a niche for the foreseeable future.
Okay, thanks very much. JP, did you want to just comment on this quickly?
Yes, a very quick comment. So exactly as Rick mentioned, it's a niche market, and there's always a risk of this competition debate that we have a focus on a niche and forget the wider picture. And we discussed so much about cloud gaming on the AAA games that we forgot that main competitive impact of the Activision Blizzard deal most likely comes from the fact that with that deal, Microsoft is able to enter mobile game markets and build their own mobile game store on Apple because they have finally King and Candy Crush in their catalog. And if Microsoft enters that markets, if Microsoft builds some kind of cross-platform distribution platform, the competitive impacts on the markets and most likely pro-competitive impacts on the markets will be much bigger than some issues on the very small cloud gaming market, where, cannot get me wrong, there might be some issues that has to be discussed and addressed as well, addressed by the competitive authorities in their investigations.
Yeah, I'm wondering if it's because it's a slightly newer area for them to look at, that there's just not the like knowledge within the regulators to look at the in a more holistic way. Anyway, we're coming up to the end. It's been really fascinating. So thanks everyone for all your input so far. You often round off Start Talking with this kind of what's going to happen in the future question, and we've got you all here, so I can't resist the opportunity to think about the next 10 years and how you see power dynamics, size, competition, and all of that playing out. So, but Natasha, I'm going to come to you first. And particularly, we had a chat earlier. We were talking about the DMA in the EU, and obviously the UK has its own very similar sounding DMU. But could you tell us a bit more about that, and also how you see that impacting the future here?
Yeah, it's still a regime that's, it's going to take a bit of time, I think, before it's fully established. And I think whether or not, the console manufacturers end up being designated with strategic market status, I think, given current definitions, it's questionable whether or not they would be. Certainly, I think PlayStation might not meet that definition. So how helpful it's going to be, that remains to be seen. I think one thing that I would say is that, as we've seen with the UK collective action regime, which is now coming up to 10 years since it was first implemented, we haven't yet had a decision in that regime, even though we're 10 years on nearly. And so, the reality is that these changes take quite a long time to flow through and actually lead to any kind of consumer benefit or real redress to these issues. So I don't actually foresee the DMU, the DMA, whatever you want to call it, giving immediate impact and having immediate effect. I think they're going to be heavily litigated still. I know that there are provisions in both of the legislation to kind of circumvent some of the length that we've seen in competition law infringements, but I'm not sure it will deliver in the way that we're expecting it to, and I think there's just going to be more litigation.
Okay. Good news for some. JP, what do you think? Are you excited about the future, or are you worried for the game developer community?
Well, games industry has always been really agile in terms of being ahead of the disruptions and building something new. What we see all around Europe at the moment is lots of companies building something new. And what is perhaps this kind of emerging trend nowadays is going cross-platform. So instead of relying only one market segment, you are publishing your game across mobile, PC, and hopefully in the future also more on console. And of course, this means that it's the role of the distribution channels, hopefully because of the DMA, etc., will be smaller and they won't be as big gatekeepers there at the moment. However, it also means that then game engines, cloud services, many of these kind of things in the background will have far bigger impact on the competition, and their role in the ecosystem and their impact on the competition is going to be quite big. So, bit worried, but optimistic.
Fantastic. Interesting state of mind to be in, but yeah, that's good. Friso, what do you think in terms of regulation? Can it keep up with the predicted changes?
Yeah, I think we're now seeing the real regulatory movement. The next 10 years are going to be about seeing how that pans out. I'm cautiously optimistic about things such as Digital Markets Act, even some competition law cases coming to a head and leading to some real change. I think most of that change we're going to see in mobile, where I think we really want to see it, perhaps less so in the console and PC markets. But I'm definitely excited about what's ahead.
Great stuff. And Rick, I'll give you the final word. Are you more excited than you've ever been about gaming? What do you think of the next 10 years?
No, I'm a evergreen evangelist for video games. Like it will carry on growing forever. But I think in terms of regulation, I think that the last couple of years have shown that regulators can have real power and muscle in terms of keeping industries, sometimes, as I said earlier, sharp practices under control. I remember a competition lawyer once telling me that almost all of these big cases get settled, and I think in these cases, the settlement is one thing, but it's what happens afterwards in terms of that settlement being viable. And I suspect that that even in the class action cases, if they're settled, that there will still be change because the regulators have really woken up.
That's what we want to see. I was going to say woke regulators, but not in the woke sense. We just want to see regulators who are on top of this, and that's great. So I want to say thank you to Natasha, Rick, JP, Thomas by video, and Friso. You've been a fantastic panel, and I've really enjoyed the sort of back and forth between you and how you've listened to each other's points, which makes it all the more helpful for the audience watching at home. So thanks to everyone also watching live or watching back and joining in. Every month we have these Start Talking webinars where we cover all sorts of topics from inflation to crypto to ChatGPT and influencers. Next month we'll be looking at the upcoming EU elections and what consumers expect from their decision makers. Remember, you can follow Euroconsumers on Twitter, X and LinkedIn, and you can keep up with all the latest consumer news. And we've just put a blog up about the Xbox accessory issue that you might be interested in. But thank you to everyone, and until next time, goodbye.
Power to the people. Someone used to sing. And while singing is not our expertise, empowering people, empowering you is what we do. And in tune. How? We test, analyze, and compare products and services to ensure that they meet what you are looking for and comply with the law. We inform, advise, support, and represent consumers, and we do this in chorus, which is to say in several countries at the same time. Belgium, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Brazil. Then we dialogue, collaborate, and sue companies if needed to make sure people's and your needs are in the best hands. And in the end, we improve the market and we all win. Maybe it does deserve a song. What do you think? Euroconsumers. Empower people, improve the market.